Everyone knows who Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, and everyone knows he's considered one of the greatest speakers of all time. He certainly wasn't the first national figure to speak out in favor of civil rights or greater socioeconomic equity between classes of people, so why is it that we hear so much more about him than other public speakers? We certainly hear about him because what he talked about was so important, but the primary reason we hear so many people talk about him is because of how he talked about the important issues of his time. What separates MLK from all of the other speakers that came before him and have come after him, in large part, is his amazing use of language in his communication. In this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the most common language strategies that you can use to bolster the impact of what you say. Crafting a well-written speech is an artistic proposition that takes time and consideration. It's also one of those things that differentiates a C from an A speech. So let's get started. First, we'll talk about language strategies, and then we'll talk about some types of language to avoid in your speeches. The first artistic element of language to consider is alliteration. If you're familiar with tongue twisters like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, you're familiar with alliteration, which is when the first letters of words are the same in a sentence. Alliteration simply sounds more pleasing to our ears, which can make you more memorable. So if you have to use some adjectives to define something, such as a storm, you could say the swift and sturdy storm. And that would probably be more memorable to your audience than using the adjectives that begin with different letters. So spend a few extra seconds to construct some alliteration, and it's time well spent. Another language strategy you might consider using is called antithesis. You create antithesis when you connect two contradicting ideas in order to make a persuasive point. The example from JFK on your screen is one of the best-known examples of this strategy. Another example from Reverend Jesse Jackson is, "We cannot be who we ought to be if we put dope in our veins rather than hope in our brains." Do you see what he did there? He took two conflicting options, drugs and education, and made a point about which path we should choose. Antithesis will help your audience remember your speech and is effective at making an argument in a quick and powerful way. People tend to like and remember things when they're grouped into threes, so the power of three is an important strategy you can use in your speeches. If you have to use adjectives to describe something, use three of them. If you want to give brief examples, give three of those. Some famous examples of the use of three come from Presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. Referring to the Great Depression, Roosevelt said, "I see one-third of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished." In his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said, "We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground." In both instances, the presidents used parallel language alongside their use of three, which makes their statements even more effective. So use the power of three and you can help the important parts of your speech stand out from the rest. You can also use signposting in your speeches to draw attention to the most important elements of the speech. Transitions are the signposts you're probably most familiar with, but you can use signposts to point to things that you want your audience to remember as well. You can use phrases like, "Let me get to the heart of the matter," or "This can't be overemphasized," or "If you remember nothing else today, please remember this." These phrases work like big neon signs pointing out the most important statements you'll make in a speech. They help the audience remember and tell the audience to pay special attention to what it is you're about to say. A signpost you may be familiar with from school is, "This will be on the test." Often, students writing papers or speeches pull up the thesaurus and try to find bigger words to replace the more common words that they've used. In some cases, you may want to use a thesaurus to replace words in your speech, especially if there's one word you're using a lot in one part of the speech and you want to add some variety. But putting bigger or more complicated words into your speech just because isn't a great idea. One important key to giving a good speech is communicating clearly. Big words that hardly anyone uses don't make communication more clear. Usually, they make it less clear. Let me give you some examples from former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who was somewhat infamous for using big words that needlessly obstructed his communication. For example, he said, "I don't want to saddle myself with a statistical fence." He also said, "It wouldn't be epistemologically wise." At one point he said, "I'm exercising careful caution." He's also said, "We are definitizing an answer." And finally, "At the moment we are subsumed in the vortex of criticality." Did you understand any of those statements? Probably not. Can you imagine being a reporter at the speech and having to try and tell anyone what that man just said? The simple rule to remember is never use a long word when a short word will do. In other words, just keep it simple. Jargon is technical language associated with areas of interest or certain professions, so it only should be used when your audience is filled with people who understand that jargon. There are definitely times when you may have to use some jargon when talking to an audience that doesn't necessarily understand the jargon you're using. In those instances, just make sure that you take the time to define the terms you have to use to the audience, and you shouldn't have a problem. If you use a bunch of jargon in front of an audience that doesn't understand it, you might as well be speaking a foreign language. One of the reasons that in spite of our best efforts we often miscommunicate is that language can be very abstract. You want to use language that's clear and direct and that can't be misunderstood by your audience. When telling a story that involves a dog, should you say what specific kind of dog? When you just say dog, we all think of whatever dog we have or whatever breed we like or maybe grew up with. So if the story depends on us imagining something big and we're thinking about a teacup poodle, you're likely to miscommunicate. In that instance, you'd need to be more specific and talk about the large type of dog specifically rather than just using the term dog. Some other examples would be saying it's raining golf ball sized hail versus just saying that there's bad weather. Or rather than saying a lot more people than you think are functionally illiterate, saying instead 27 million adults, 1 in 5 is functionally illiterate. The more specific you are in your language use, the less likely you are to miscommunicate your message and be misunderstood. Make sure that you don't make the very easy mistake of exaggerating in your speech. We often say things like always or never without thinking about what we're really saying. And that may be okay in informal settings with friends, but if you make the mistake in a formal speaking event, it's an easy way for an audience member to challenge you. Very few things are always or never true or always or never happen. So be careful about careless language use that can get you into some trouble. Always avoid profanity in speeches. Don't ever assume that it's okay to use profanity, as it is very, very rarely the case that it is. This is obviously a judgment call that you have to make, but if you're unsure, always err against using it. You can ruin your credibility with an audience immediately by using profanity. You should also avoid using slang. Slang is a language created by subsets of people, often groups designated by age or subculture. And just like with jargon, you risk using language that members of your audience can't understand when you use slang, so you also need to try to avoid that too. Also try to avoid powerless language. Powerless language is language that minimizes you and your message. It comes in a number of forms. Hedging is when we add something to a statement such as, it seems to me, or in my estimation, or I think we should, or I sort of think, or maybe we should. Another form of powerless language are tag questions that we add to the end of our statements, such as, don't you think? Women tend to use powerless language more than men, so women should be especially careful about using this type of language. There are some instances when you actually do want to use more powerless language in meetings, and these times are usually when you're trying to negotiate or solve a conflict or problem. Sometimes in these situations, it's good to use less sure language that leaves the impression in others that you're open to other views. But if you're in a situation where you're supposed to persuade, you should avoid it. Think about being a salesperson. If you were trying to sell a car, would you say, I sort of think this is a great car? Of course not. So pay attention to context and realize when it's important to use or not use powerful and powerless language. Personalizing your language is a great way to continue that link to audience that you created in your introduction. If throughout the speech you're constantly using words like us, we, and our, you're constantly reminding your audience that they have something to lose or gain, and therefore they should keep paying attention to what you're saying. The next thing I want to talk about is language that you should avoid, specifically sexist language. Sexist language is language that demeans, ignores, or stereotypes members of either sex, or that needlessly calls attention to the sex of a person. One of the main reasons you should avoid sexist language is because using it can just tick people off. Many people use it because it's how we've always talked, but that's not really a great reason to keep using language that's considered unethical, because it doesn't represent reality. And we didn't actually always use sexist language. The use of sexist language was codified in the UK Parliament in the 1800s in response to the growing women's movement in favor of voting and education rights for women. Because people didn't change their language, folks were actually arrested for using sexist language as a means of making people conform to the law. Because think about it, does it really make sense to look at a woman dressed in a police uniform and call her a policeman? Of course it doesn't. So folks before the 1800s didn't actually use this type of language until it was forced on them by law. You also want to avoid using sexist language because it can communicate something about you. Perhaps you don't have a sexist bone in your body, but if you use sexist language at an event because you're not being careful with your language use, people may assume that you are sexist. If you're not persuaded by the argument that it's unethical or that it can hurt your credibility to use sexist language, perhaps you'll be persuaded by the fact that the Modern Language Association, or what you know as MLA, banned sexist language in the 1970s, as did every other primary writing style manual, including the APA, Chicago, and Harvard writing guides. Sexist language is considered unethical language because it doesn't reflect reality. When you use words that eliminate the possibility of women being firefighters or of men being nurses, that's simply not a language that reflects the reality of the world. Thus, it's not considered ethical. The most common type of sexist language is man-linked terms. These are terms like fireman, policeman, chairman, and congressman. These terms links jobs to just one sex, and as I mentioned before, does it really make sense to look at a woman and call her a congressman? Instead, you can use firefighter, police officer, chair, or congressmember. There are plenty of online non-sexist language dictionaries that can help you find a word if you're not sure. And if you're addressing just one person and that person happens to be a woman who's a police officer, then of course it's okay to say policewoman. You just wouldn't want to say that when addressing a man who is a police officer or vice versa. Man-linked language can also happen in images. There aren't many words that are woman-linked, but gender role stereotypes have made it so that some vocations are linked to women, and these images of people doing jobs tend to be pictures of women. Think about textbooks growing up. Many of us saw images of female nurses, teachers, or dancers. That sort of sexism in images discourages boys from entire careers, just as calling all people policemen discourages girls from choosing that career. Study after study since the 1970s proves that kids determine, to a large extent, what they can and can't do based on the language used to communicate what sex does which jobs. Isn't it time we stopped limiting the opportunities and imaginations of little boys and little girls and eliminate the use of sexist language altogether? Another type of sexist language that's common is the generic he. This is when you hear people talking about mankind instead of humankind, or saying something like, this is the greatest pizza known to man, instead of known to humanity. The argument that people use to support the maintenance of this language is that everyone knows that when we say mankind, we mean women too, but do we really? If we really thought about this as a true generic term that encompassed both men and women, then why don't we hear people talking about mankind getting pregnant, or man getting his monthly menstrual cycle? We don't, because in our minds we really do know that man doesn't actually account for both men and women, so why keep using it? Use humankind or humanity instead. Finally, let's talk about spotlighting. This is when we mark a sentence with the sex of someone by saying the male nurse or the female lawyer. Why do we do that? We do it because we know that these jobs are ones typically ascribed to one sex or the other, so that when a person of the opposite sex is doing that job, for some reason we feel the need to mark that person as doing something out of the ordinary. So skip the unnecessary spotlighting and just say lawyer or nurse. Who cares what the sex of the person doing the job is, as long as they're doing the job well?